Despite living in Ireland for the first 18 years of my life, and being to Dublin many, many times, I've never actually done the tourist things in Dublin. I've always been to Dublin for a specific reason to do specific things, most of which were not particularly touristy. So, let's spend 8 hours today doing the tourist stuff. First off, we start at Euston Station, which is significant for being one of the oldest railway stations in the world, having been opened in 1846, and is the main station for trains travelling to the southwest from Dublin. It was renamed in 1966 to Euston Station after Sean Euston, who was a railway worker who was executed during the 1916 Rising. Straight across from Euston Station is St James Street Brewery, the home of Guinness and the largest stout factory in the world, producing 50 million barrels of stout and related Guinness products, I suppose, a year. It's conveniently located on the Liffey, which was used for transportation to the canals to distribute Guinness throughout the rest of the country, and it is said that Guinness travelled by canals is much superior to modern Guinness that is transported by train and trucks and so forth. The brewery is renowned for having a 9,000-year lease that they still mention in some advertisements, even though this lease hasn't actually been in effect for literally hundreds of years, since it was originally bought out when the brewery first expanded. Continuing down the Liffey, we then come across the James Joyce Bridge, one of the many references to the author throughout Dublin City. It's also notable for using glass as its footpath, which, that's not scary or dangerously slippy at all. Staying on the north side of Liffey and continuing on the Lewis Red Line, we arrive at Smithfield, which is famous, one, for its biannual horse fair, and two, for having an odd tower that looks like it was once a chimney. That's because it was once a chimney. This is the old Jameson Distillery, which opened in 1840 and was at the time known as sort of a city within a city because of how self-sufficient it was. Jameson whiskey was brewed here until 1971, when this distillery closed and moved to another site. It currently houses a visitor centre, of course, where you can learn about the famous whiskey. Heading back to Liffey, we then come across the Four Courts, so named because it houses the Supreme Court, the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and the Dublin Circuit Court. The building was built in the end of the 18th century and has nearly always housed four courts. This was where the Irish Civil War began, and the building was originally destroyed in this war and rebuilt in the decade afterwards. But since the Irish public records, 1,000 years worth of records, was destroyed in that war, the famously decorative interior could not be rebuilt because the plans were also in the public records. We then come across Scrattenbridge, which is famous for having these weird half-fish, half-horse lamp decorations on it. From Scrattenbridge, we then walk by the seagulls along the Liffey boardwalk towards the Millennium Bridge, which, as its plaque says, was opened for the millennium in 2000. This is not to be confused by another bridge further down the Liffey that is a near copy of London's Millennium Bridge. Not that that was ever going to cause confusion. We then pass through the Jervis, through Ireland's Little Italy, featuring this version of the Last Supper, outside an ice cream shop. Interesting. And this brings us to Jervis Square, which has a tram, an obscene amount of pigeons, a bronze bull, and is next to the Jervis Shopping Centre. It's one of the busiest shopping centres in Dublin and as one of the busiest tram stops in the city, with it being the January sale season. We then cross through here to Henry Street, which features the fanciest pennies in the world, and we continue down Henry Street, the main shopping street of Dublin, towards O'Connell Street. On the way to O'Connell Street, we pass by Arnott's, Dublin's largest and oldest department store. This was opened in 1843 and is one of the most famous shops in Dublin. For people outside of Dublin, it is famous for being the sponsors of Dublin's GAA teams. At the end of Henry Street, we then come across one of Dublin's modern landmarks, the Spire, which was built in January 2003 and is the tallest piece of art in the world, actually. This was built as a replacement for Nelson's Column, which was destroyed in 1966. This brings us to O'Connell Street, Dublin's main street and one of the widest streets in Europe. It was originally called Sackville Street, but later renamed after Daniel O'Connell, and is notable for having the spire, statues, historic buildings, even though most of the buildings here were rebuilt in the 20s after the 1916 Rising. Speaking of the 1916 Rising, right here we have the GPO, or the General Post Office. This was the rebels' headquarters during the Rising and saw where they made their last stand here and in the surrounding area. This is also where during that Rising the proclamation of the Irish Republic was read out and is seen as the birthplace of the Irish Republic. It is also historic headquarters of An Post, the Irish Postal Service, because, it still is a post office. First of statues we come across is of Jim Larkin, who was an Irish labour leader and founder of the Irish trade union movement, and continuing down towards the end of the street we come across one of the largest statues down O'Connell Street of O'Connell himself. O'Connell was an Irish parliamentarian who campaigned for general Irish freedom, rights for Catholics, and restored the Irish Parliament. It is also one of the busiest junctions in the city, and is renowned for its traffic jams, as you would expect. And now we have a mini rant. Like most of these trips, I'll be spending most of this day using a day ticket to use all public transport in the city, because these are generally the best value for money for travelling around cities like this. And Dublin's version of this is actually quite good, as it's not restrictive like a lot of cities. Yes, it's slightly more expensive than most cities, being €10, but for what you get, I think it's quite good value. The only problem with it is that there's only 5 places in Dublin where you can buy this. 2 of them being the airport, which makes sense, perfect sense, and 3 of them being on O'Connell Street, which, that's fine, but why can I not buy this at any train station, bus station, anywhere else, really? That's my main issue with it, is that I had to walk for an hour to get to a place where I could buy this, even though I arrived on public transport. Doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so my advice is if you're travelling to Dublin and not arriving in the airport, I repeat, not arriving in the airport, buy this ticket in advance, get it delivered to you, and so you can use public transport from the moment you arrive in Dublin. Also, it comes in 3-day and 7-day tickets, which are actually good value for money, so I would recommend them as well. And the Airport Express bus is included in this, which itself costs €7 each way, so, work it out yourself. It's actually quite good value. Just off O'Connell Street is a statue of James Joyce, Dublin's famous eccentric author. And said there's many references to James Joyce throughout the city, and there's this little statue here for him. Not too grand. Continue down O'Connell Street, where we find the Clarkton, which is now closed, I think. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that the entire front of this building is a fake movie set sort of situation here, which has been there so long, the movie set is probably more historic than the buildings it's pretending to be. Ironically, it's right across from the Savoy Cinema, which is Ireland's premier cinema and where a lot of the national premieres are held. It's also quite fancy and a lot bigger than it looks from the outside. Again off O'Connell Street is St. Thomas's Church, which is a small little church here, but if church is too slow for you, there is always Jesus in a box for your worship on the fly. At the top of O'Connell Street is the Parnell Monument, an obelisk of Galway granite dedicated to Charles Stewart Parnell, who, like O'Connell, as we mentioned earlier, was another advocate for Irish Home Rule and at one point was known as the uncrowned King of Ireland. So that brings us to the top of O'Connell Street, and we then continue along Parnell Street, past the Rotunda Hospital and the Ambassador Theatre, to the Gardens of Remembrance behind the Rotunda Hospital. This is a garden dedicated to all those who died during the fight for Irish freedoms, such as the Rising and the War of Independence. Each is a pool in the shape of a cross and a wall of names, as well as a statue in the centre, which is based on the Irish story of the Children of Lear. For some reason it was closed on the day I showed it, but generally it will be open. So, we take a bus through North Dublin to our next stop, which is Glasnevin Cemetery. Glasnevin is effectively Ireland's national cemetery, housing the graves of many prominent Irish figures of recent history. It is notable for having the graves of many Irish Republicans, executed rebels, and such. So, and has the tomb of Daniel Connell. Presidents are buried here. But amongst all this is just hundreds of normal Dubliners' graves, which is interesting if you're a historian, because essentially here's a massive source of history that you can just walk around. The cemetery also features several memorials to the rising Irish War of Independence and those who have died in modern wars in the service of the Defence Forces. One of the most famous graves in Glasnevin is to Michael Collins, who was the head of intelligence during the War of Independence, proponent of guerrilla warfare during the war, and negotiated a treaty that ended the war and founded the Irish Free State. He then led the Free State forces during the Irish Civil War, during which he was killed in an ambush in 1922. We then hop back on the bus towards Drumcondra, where we find the Royal Canal. This canal connects Dublin and Longford via the River Shannon and is about 140 kilometres long. The canal, like most canals in Ireland, fell into disrepair in the early 20th century, but has since been cleaned up and restored, and you can now travel along nearly its entire original length. Also here is a statue of Brendan Beehn, a famous Irish writer who is notable for being the first drunk to be interviewed by the BBC and having the biggest funeral in Ireland since Michael Collins. Walking along the canal, we head towards Croke Park, Ireland's largest stadium and the headquarters of the GAA. This is where Ireland's equivalent to the Super Bowl is held, the All-Ireland finals, each year in September, and they're so good we do them twice for both hurling and football, 2 of 4 national sports. The stadium also has a museum of the GAA, and you can actually walk on the roof of the stadium if that takes your fancy. A short walk from the station is Drumcondra Station, which is really only a commuter station and as such doesn't have many services in the afternoon. But if you just happen to have timed it so that you are in Drumcondra Station while a train is due to pass through, this is a very efficient way to get across the city to one of the largest stations in Dublin, Connolly Station, which is useful for us as we head out towards the next stop towards Holt. But as we're in Connolly, Connolly is essentially Dublin's central station if Dublin had a central station, with it taking commuter services from across the Dublin region, intercity trains to the north and south coast, as well as intersections with the Dart, Lewis, and being across the road from Dublin's central bus station. So, as I said, we took the Dart out of Connolly towards Holt. Holt is a fishing town north of Dublin, famous obviously for its port, for it being a general tourist town, and for its cliffs on Holt Head, and the several walks along the cliffs that attract many walkers. And if I was in the mood for a walk, I probably would have taken them, but I just partly went up the cliffs to have a look around. The town is also home to the headquarters of the Irish Olympic Committee, as well as the best named museum in the world, Ye Old Hurdy-Gurdy Museum of Vintage Radios, which was closed on the day I was there, and I wouldn't have had time anyway. Also didn't have time to try the famous fish and chips, so I just had a sausage roll. So we headed back on the Dart towards Pearse Station in south central Dublin. This is where things would ramp up a little bit as the sights would come thick and fast. Short walk from Pearse Station, we arrive here at Marion Square, which is one of the most affluent parts of Dublin, and is also the birthplace of Oscar Wilde, who grew up here in this very house on the corner of Marion Square. Conveniently across the road, there is a statue of the famous writer himself, perched on a rock, really rather casual. Probably the most casual statue you'll find in Dublin. Continuing along Marion Street, we come across the National Art Library of Ireland, and then briefly popping back into the park, we have the Eternal Flame, a national memorial to all those who have died in the Defence Forces. The monument consists of this pyramid, which contains statues of 4 bronze figures representing the 4 branches of the Defence Forces. Across from this memorial is Leinster House and the government buildings, Leinster House being the home of Dáil Éireann, Irish Parliament, and the government buildings surrounding it housing various departments of the government, such as here the Department of Taoiseach, which is next Department of Finance, Attorney General. You get the idea. Also housed here are two of the campuses of the National Museum, which is free entry and well worth it. Continuing on top of Marion Street and rounding the corner, we then arrive at St. Stephen's Green, where on the corner we find the statue of Wolfe Tone, known as the father of Irish republicanism and led the 1798 rebellion, for being captured when that rebellion failed and died in prison. Across from the statue is the Shelburne Hotel, a 5-star hotel regarded as one of the finest in Dublin, and even has its own TV show. What more could you want from a hotel? Also, they charge £100 a bottle for champagne, so if you've got too much money on your hands, that's the place to go. We then continue on walking through the park. St. Stephen's Green is one of Dublin's prettiest and most popular parks. It's good for good reason. Also notable is the amount of birds in this park. If you like birds, this is the place to go. Yes, most of them are seagulls, and no one really cares for seagulls and pigeons, but we spotted occasionally herons in here, the swans, a few ducks. They're somehow surviving here, but yeah. Conveniently, St. Stephen's Green also leads you on to Grafton Street, which is Dublin's main shopping street. Was pedestrianised in the 70s, probably one of the first streets in Dublin to be properly pedestrianised. Was it 70s? I'm not sure. It got pedestrianised at some point, and that was quite notable. On Grafton Street we can find Bulay's Oriental Cafe. The original Bulay's Cafe opened here in 1927. It's one of the prettiest cafes in Dublin, generally regarded as a landmark, and was recently refurbished. We then come to Suffolk Street, where in front of the church is a statue of Molly Malone, who is a character from the famous song which is the unofficial anthem of Dublin. The statue was originally on Grafton Street, but was moved a few years ago to its present location to make way for extension of a tram line. This brings us to College Green. Across from the college, Trinity College, right in front of us, and it is a busy intersection, as you can see, though it's mostly now only used by buses and trams. It's across from the old Irish Parliament, back when Ireland had a parliament under British rule, which later became the head of Irish Bank. And in the middle of it all is a familiar name, Grattan, whose bridge we saw earlier, and here is his statue. You will also note that the lampposts here have the same half-horse, half-fish figures that are on the bridge. Continuing down Dame Street, we come to the old Central Bank building, which I've always found it to be quite a cool building, even if it doesn't really fit in at all with the surrounding landscape. It's been redeveloped into something, and notable for having a floating golden ball in front of it, because what tells you more about Central Bank than a floating golden ball? We then came across this, what I believe is a discreet advertisement for WeBuyAnyCar.com, even though they don't operate in Ireland, so I found that weird. Across from it is probably the most colourful bar in Dublin, so maybe this is a colourful street and this is what they do here. This then brings us to the City Hall, where they're quite excited about the New Year's coming up. And around the corner from the City Hall is Dublin Castle. Dublin Castle was originally built in the 13th century, more or less with the foundation of Dublin as a city, and has been here ever since. During British rule, it was the centre of British rule in Ireland. With the independence, it got handed over to the Irish government and has since been used for state functions such as banquets, state visits, presidential inaugurations, etc. There still is a tower though, and a chapel dating from medieval times. So we then head along the narrow cobbled streets, and the most accurately named street in Dublin, Curve Street, because guess what? It's curved. And then this brings us to the Temple Bar, the most famous pub in Dublin, originally founded by Sir William Temple. And it's become so popular it's given its name to the whole area surrounding the Temple Bar, which is just known as Temple Bar. This area of Dublin is, as you can see, is renowned for its restaurants, bars, clubs, and more or less all other joyful things that I don't really have much interest in. And, as the name is in would suggest, we are now at Halfpenny Bridge, Dublin's most famous bridge and one of Dublin's most famous landmarks. This cast iron bridge was built in 1816 to replace the run-down ferry services that operated on the Liffey, the toll, halfpenny, being more or less the replacement fare that you would have paid for a ferry. In 1919, the toll was removed, and now you can walk, and have been able to walk ever since, free across the Liffey on Halfpenny Bridge. This brings us conveniently at Jervis, where we hop back on the Lewis to head to the final leg for the stay in Dublin. So we go right to the end of the Lewis Red Line to the Point, which is the very end of the Dublin Docklines, which for the last nearly 20 years has been a permanent building site as the whole area is being redeveloped. You may notice in the arena here that that looks an awful lot like a railway depot, because that used to be a railway shed, because this whole area 30 years ago was just a huge railway freight yard, because right next to us, across the wall there, is Dublin Port. Literally on the other side of that wall is Ireland's largest port. Right next to, the modern arena, hotels, apartments, futuristic modern buildings. Some Docklands is kind of a weird and strange place. From where it's come and how fast it has changed has been quite impressive. The rapid change this area has been nothing short of astonishing. There's a time within living memory that you would not go to North Wall or East Wall, at any time, not to mind at night, for fear of not making it out alive. The Docklands was a tough place to live, but it's completely changed. Absolutely completely changed. This is where all the modern tech and financial multinationals are based now. This is where the luxury apartments are. It's complete turnaround. Absolute complete turnaround. The redevelopment, though, comes at the cost of the likes of these buildings. These are some of the last red brick buildings left in North Wall. This brings us to the Custom House, a large square building with a glass cylinder going through the side of it. As the name suggests, it's used for general conventions and meetings and that sort of thing. Across from it is Samuel Beckett Bridge, which looks like a harp on the side. It's one of Dublin's newest bridges, and interestingly, the bridge turns to open to allow this ship to go to the sea. This is the Jeannie Johnson, currently under restoration, and this is a coffin ship which was used in the 19th century from the famine onwards to take people escaping the famine off to America in hopes of better lives. Speaking of the famine, we then come on to the Famine Memorial, which consists of a group of statues depicting people escaping and immigrating from Ireland during the famine. During the famine, 1 million people died of hunger, but nearly more left Ireland and started a wave of emigration that would continue more or less unabated until the late 30s. This brings us then to the Custom House, which was built in 1781 despite the protests from several angry mobs. It currently houses the Department of Planning, Local Government and Housing. Behind the Custom House, we then come to Bus Áras, which is Dublin's central bus station, built in the late 40s and was very modern for the time and simultaneously loved and hated by the general population. It's renowned for its curvy roof and the use of materials through the building. It also houses the Department of Social Protection, which, you'd expect that at a bus station, wouldn't you? And behind Bus Áras is this eternal flame, which is a memorial to the missing, which is covered in padlocks of lovers, which I find it odd that lovers would decide to padlock themselves to a monument for people who've gone missing and been kidnapped. But at this point, it was already getting dark, so that means I headed straight back to Euston Station, and it also means unfortunately we will not get to go to the Phoenix Park today. For those who don't know, the Phoenix Park is the world's largest city park, which is located very near Euston Station here, and you could legitimately spend an entire day without leaving Phoenix Park, especially as it houses Dublin Zoo, which is nearly a whole day in itself, as well as various other things, which are more or less there to be discovered in the Phoenix Park. So yeah, that was Dublin in 8 hours. Possibly could have got longer if we went in the summer, but I didn't go in the summer. This is January, and you gotta deal with that. Also, a tip if you're ever in Euston Station, this lemonade here is €1 for 1 litre lemonade. It's the cheapest drink you can buy in the station. I'm shocked as you are that I got it in M&S. So with our cheap lemonade, we headed to our train and headed home.